Okay, so in this episode, we're going to continue looking at three types of fats. One thing I wanted to add from our last episode, and this will probably kind of help us get to where we are, when we talked about fatty acids and the roles of fatty acids, like I mentioned in class, we're going to make some of the structures by hand, but I have a link to a video. It'll be right in the corner right over here right now, that if you want to kind of get a head start on that, get an idea of, okay, what are cis and trans fats, what does this actually look like, a little more in-depth explanation. You can follow that link right there. I encourage you to do that. In fact, you can pause this video, watch that, and then continue back to this. We're going to just get into three groups of fats here. This will be a fairly short one. After this, we're going to tackle digestion and absorption in the next lecture. So three types of fats. The first one, and by far the most common one, is going to be triglycerides. So when we talk about fats, generally most of the time we're going to talk about triglycerides. And so when we think of triglycerides, the basic structure of triglyceride is going to be 1, 2, 3 fatty acids. And you'll notice here they can be saturated, as in palmitic acid right there. It could be monounsaturated, oleic acid. Or it could be like linoleic acid here, polyunsaturated. So three, you have 3 fatty acids. And attached to these, in order to make them a fatty acid, you need glycerol. And so glycerol is this part right here. It's going to be a 3-carbon structure. And this is going to help us form a triglyceride. And so most of our diet is made up of triglycerides. And most of the way these are stored is made up of triglycerides. Now, triglycerides, if you've heard that term before, you've probably heard it in the connotation of having your triglycerides measured, and that having a lot of those is bad, and that is true. That's a little bit different than what we're talking about as far as how we take these fats in. Most of these in our diet are going to be stored in this way, and obviously not all of those, if they're more polyunsaturated, are that bad. But understand, the triglycerides we take in and ultimately how we store them are a little bit different. So triglycerides are one form, but they're not the only form. And so even though we're going to really be talking about those mostly in this chapter, I do want to focus on the 2 other groups here because they are important. The second group is what we call the sterols. Now, you probably never heard of sterol, but you have probably heard of cholesterol. And cholesterol technically is a sterol, a lipid, a fat. And sterols are unique, and in fact, if you look at the diagram over here, sterols actually look a whole lot more like a whole bunch of glucose and fructose put together, and though they're not, they do have a similar ring structure. And so sterols are very different in fatty acids, very different than the triglycerides they make. Sterols, we see these in vitamins like vitamin D. We'll see this in some hormones. We'll look at testosterone, cortisol, things like that, are sterols. And then obviously cholesterol, which is something we'll look at a lot later on in this chapter as far as the storage form of fat, mostly in mammals. And so sterols are going to have a huge role here, although they're fairly minor in our actual diet. They obviously do have a major role physiologically in ourselves. These also play a large role in cell membranes. Now, not as much as the third one we'll look at, but cholesterol, large role, again, more in our bodies, not so much in nutritionally what we take in. So we have triglycerides, we have sterols in our third group. Again, fairly minor in our diet, but important in physiology, particularly cell function, are phospholipids. So phospholipids, if you've ever taken Bio 1, anatomy, things like that, you may recall the phospholipids make up the cell membrane of cells. In fact, we call it the phospholipid bilayer. And so phospholipids have a huge role in how the cells function and how they maintain their integrity. And so this kind of gives you a chemical structure here of what a phospholipid looks like. Don't memorize this. This is, again, not biochemistry. But once you grasp that this is a third group, though fairly minor in our diet, this is another form of fat. And again, they contain phosphates. There's a phosphate group. And so understanding this, one other part of this that I want to bring up, because we'll see this later on, is lecithin, otherwise known as phosphatidylcholine, is a phospholipid. And in fact, it actually is a somewhat common ingredient, soy lecithin, in some foods that you'll see on nutrition labels, particularly baked goods, powders, things like that. Soy lecithin is often a common ingredient that's added. It's not bad. It's not even artificial, but it is a phospholipid. Technically, it's a fat. And we find these in soybeans, legumes especially, liver, one of the best nutrient food rich foods, by the way, in case you care. Cod liver oil especially. Go cod liver. But lecithin is a place where we'll find another group here of phospholipids. So these are our basic three groups of fats. Our next lecture is going to move to digestion of fats and how we do that, how we absorb them, and that'll then introduce the role of LDL and HDL cholesterol, which has a huge role in health and ultimately in heart disease.